Alright, so real quick. I had to split this video in two because it was getting too long and it was really two videos anyway. So it ends abruptly and there will be a second part. This is a response video to TrueDilTom over his interpretation of Aristotle's doctrine of natural slavery. I like Tom's videos. Honestly, he should be proud of them, so I'm not really personally hostile to him. But you know, somebody's wrong on the internet and so they have to get roasted. And the way I do it has profound implications for philosophy. What I do is introduce my doctrine of Mutatis Mutandis, a Latin phrase meaning all necessary changes being made. Alright, so there is a YouTuber, TrueDilTom, who has made the latest contribution to a sort of series of response videos, the argument of which I'll quickly characterize in a general way. And if you want to see them, I have included a link to a playlist in the description. So, I'll tell you how I saw it. Sargon of Akkad was on with Dave Rubin, and he was discussing what the difference is between libertarianism and liberalism, or classical liberalism in particular. Sargon of Akkad makes a point of being a classical liberal and not a libertarian. That guy T made a contribution to the debate with his last video of the year called The Necessary Oppression of the Left, in which he went full fash. For T, we have a moral obligation to oppress the left because oppression is essentially injustice or systematic injustice, and the left's conception of justice requires that we violate libertarians' conception of justice, especially property rights, and as we all know, libertarianism is essentially true. I saw this and I agree that justice does require that we oppress the left, but I like making fun of libertarians, and so I made a response video called That Guy T and the Necessary Oppression of Libertarians. See, I like libertarians more than most ideologies, and I think I can compromise and live in a society ruled by libertarians and be happy. I'm down with Austrian economics, but I just don't think that they have thought through the problem of justice. So, in T's video, he included some commentary from the YouTuber that is the subject of the present video, TrueDilTom, about whom I made a few remarks and who was nice enough to take the time to make a response video to me. I've watched some more of his videos now, and they are very agreeable even for someone like me that isn't a libertarian, and I think it's likely that he is one of the libertarians that I would be satisfied to be ruled by. So, none of this is like the typical feminist response video where the standard has to be no less than, all your ideas are garbage. This is a video about a few things where I disagree with someone who seems to be someone such that I could live in a society that he ruled. That being said, our disagreements are not trivial, and they merit this response video. In my video, I introduced my argument with a quote from Aristotle's Politics, and Tom, in addition to addressing the point that I made about libertarianism, also made some unrelated points about Aristotle. And it's fine that he did, and I'm happy that he did, since I hear about this part of Aristotle's thought often, and it is quite useful to discuss. That is, Aristotle's doctrine of natural slavery. So, in this video, I'm going to deal with 2 points. First, I'm going to have to stand up for my boy, Aristotle, and second, did Tom actually save libertarianism from necessary oppression? Here is the essential part of my argument from my last video. We're going to look at a quote from Aristotle's Politics, but before I show you this quote, I have to set it up properly. I want to let you know that constitution is a translation of the Greek word politia, which in this context very nearly means faction. When Aristotle speaks of an oligarchic constitution and a democratic constitution, he is speaking about the oligarchic faction and the democratic faction. So, from Aristotle's Politics, we should notice that not only some aristocracies, but also some oligarchies survive, not because their constitutions are secure, but because those in office treat well both those outside the Constitution and those in the governing class. They do this by not being unjust to the non-participants and by bringing their leading men into the Constitution. So, in other words, we can preserve society when people with property pander to those without property. A large group of people like that are susceptible to charismatic demagogues. The only sort of libertarian solution I can think of is that free markets are best for everyone. A rising tide lifts all boats. I agree with that, but people don't think things through. They only have to think they are being ripped off to form a faction and confront all the people with property. And so some deal has to be struck. Some arrangement has to be reached that is acceptable to all or most people. And it is very likely that the people that think taxation is theft will think they are being oppressed. In fact, to many people, pandering to people without property is considered to be an illegitimate function of government, and yet it is necessary for the preservation of society. So, for me, it doesn't really have anything to do with defining freedom so as to consider poor people to be oppressed, but rather it has to do with preempting a proletarian-style revolution. I suppose that in practice, I might have to come up with some BS definition of something to be successful in pandering to the proles, but maybe I wouldn't need to, and in any case, we could chalk that up to being a noble lie. So, Tom responds by taking issue with my referring to Aristotle.
So, sorry, Derek, no disrespect, but you could have just said that last part and not given us the Aristotle quote, right? And the reason I say this rather than addressing your point just now is because you're just asserting this. Aristotle saying it doesn't validate it.
Wait, so you're saying Aristotle saying it doesn't validate it, and...
So, sorry, Derek, no disrespect, but you could have just said that last part and not given us the Aristotle quote, right?
So, if there was a part to my video that I had such that I didn't need the Aristotle quote, then it doesn't really follow that I think that saying Aristotle said something validates it, right? You have strawmanned me. I mention Aristotle all the time for many reasons, in this case because Aristotle was the original source about my thinking on the issue. If I were fanatically opposed to name dropping, and yet I were promoting the thought of certain people, that would certainly point toward plagiarism. I'm not the type that hides my influences. I'd rather get them on the table to facilitate discussion. But also, I mention Aristotle because I think he has some championship belts, and I want to place my idea in the context of his system of thought. This reason, however, was anticipated by Tom, since he continues by criticizing that very system of thought.
I have read Aristotle's Politics, and he's far from an authority on contemporary political philosophy. His philosophical value is obviously differing throughout the texts, of course, but to give you a brief example of what I mean, in Book 1 of Politics, as you would know, Aristotle establishes his doctrine of natural slavery, claiming that there are people who are slaves by nature as a justification for his very own belief in slavery. So when we're talking about freedom, I'm not very persuaded by a mere assertion, even if it's made by Aristotle.
There's a Latin phrase that we are going to discuss, Mutatis Mutandis, which means all necessary changes being made. So, when we try to bring the likes of Aristotle into our time to comment on the current year, we are embarking on an extremely difficult, treacherous task, but a task that is incredibly important since we cannot know beforehand whether it is possible. I'm not accusing you of this, Tom, but the idea that political thought is necessarily limited to its society, that is, that there can't be a political doctrine applicable to all societies, is known as historicism. Now, exactly since I am not accusing you of being a historicist, I'm going to take it for granted that we accept the possibility that someone's political thought could apply to a different age, and that perhaps you just think in particular that Aristotle's thought doesn't live up to that incredibly tall order. Well, It certainly won't if we stubbornly apply his thought directly to our society. Rather, what we have to do is become familiar with Aristotle's thought, how it related to his society, and then imagine what Aristotle would think about our society, including how his having this new experience would alter his thought. We have to consider Aristotle Mutatis Mutandis. At this point, we might have to refer to Derrick's Aristotle instead of simply to Aristotle, but there certainly is a basis in Aristotle's thought for this. For example, in the very same natural slavery doctrine you cite, near the beginning of his discussion, he says, if each tool could perform its task on command, or by anticipating instructions, and if, like the statues of Daedalus, or the tripods of Hephaestus, which the poet describes as having entered the assembly of the gods of their own accord, shuttles wove cloth by themselves, and picks played the lyre, a master craftsman would not need assistants, and masters would not need slaves. This is a remarkable quote, and I am not sure why it is not more well known. The statues of Daedalus and the tripods of Hephaestus were able to move on their own, like what we think of as robots or machines. Paul Ray wrote about this passage that the desire to be at leisure for political action explains why a world requiring no labor at all was one of the abiding fantasies of Greek imagination. It seems as though Aristotle has described something like industrialized society, and that isn't even a stretch. And thankfully, Tom was not shy in his video, and he let some of his influences be known by showing us his solid quarry. He has a book in there, Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics, which has a fine section that really should seal the deal for reading Aristotle Mutatis Mutandis in the way that I have described. I only have the Kindle version, so I don't know how the page numbers match, but here are some of the quotes. Although workers may be thought of as people who simply supply labor, what most people supply is not just their ability to engage in physical exertions, but their ability to apply mental proficiency to their tasks. The time when a strong back and a weak mind were sufficient for many jobs is long past in most modern economies. Obvious as this may seem, its implications are not equally obvious nor always widely understood. In those times and places where physical strength and stamina have been the principal work requirements, productivity and pay have tended to reach their peak in the youthful prime of life, with middle-aged laborers receiving less pay or less frequent employment, or both. A premium on physical strength likewise favored male workers over female workers. And then the rising importance of skills and experience relative to physical strength has changed the relative productivities of youth compared to age and of women compared to men. This has been especially so in more recent times as the power of machines has replaced human strength in industrial societies and as skills have become crucial in high-tech economies. The section goes on with some fine details, and I included some of Sowell's comments about women to suggest that we need to read Aristotle's views on women, Mutatis Mutandis, as well. Hell, we need to read Jefferson and Madison's views on women, Mutatis Mutandis. But the resemblance to Aristotle's Daedalus quote is clear. And another point, the Greeks did not use the term natural in the way that we do. Actually, physis is the Greek word for nature. For the Greeks, nature had a generating element. Greek philosophy is said to have a teleological view of nature, meaning that something's goal is included in an account of what it is. From these considerations, and from actually reading Aristotle's natural slavery doctrine, it is not clear that he means large groups of people are genetically inferior and should be condemned to slavery. Rather, the idea that civilization is something that someone needs to be indoctrinated with or immersed with in their entire youth, and that there isn't enough of it to go around, especially in Aristotle's time without Daedalus machines, fits very well with his doctrine of natural slavery. Furthermore, Aristotle discusses at some length slavery by law as opposed to nature, and he admits the possibility of unjust slavery. I learned from Harry Jaffe's first book on Abraham Lincoln, Crisis of the House Divided, that much later in the Politics, Aristotle says that later we shall discuss how slaves should be treated and why it is better to hold out freedom as a reward to all slaves. Jaffe notes that Aristotle's Politics has apparently come down to us incomplete, and that Aristotle apparently hasn't kept his promise. But clearly, this remark suggests the more general reading of natural, that is, more general than merely being genetic. It suggests that, as Lincoln put it, slavery should be in the course of ultimate extinction. Another line from Aristotle about slavery that I like is at the end of Book 8, Chapter 2, that what one acts or learns for also makes a big difference. For what one does for one's own sake, for the sake of friends, or on account of virtue is not unfree, but someone who does the same thing for others would often be held to be acting like a hired laborer or a slave. And in Book 6, Chapter 2, he says about democracy that one mark of freedom is to live as one likes. This, they say, is the result of freedom, since that of slavery is not to live as one likes. Now, I have 3 translations of the Politics, and these passages are translated slightly differently each time, so I take these 2 statements from Aristotle to mean that slavery is when you live for someone else's goals. Now, I think that is a bit hyperbolic or utopian, but it is nonetheless quite a fine thought to ponder in the current year, especially with the endless monotony of wage labor. So finally, considering all this, and that his natural slavery doctrine is based on the distinction between being ruled by reason or ruled by passion, it is not hard at all to read Aristotle's doctrine of natural slavery, Mutatis Mutandis, as a doctrine of elitism, since it pretty much reads like that anyway. I reread it preparing for this video, and I certainly think it is a valuable part of Aristotle's thought to consider. It is not merely some 4th century BC nonsense to dismiss like his theory of gravity. Actually, looked at as a doctrine of elitism, I think it is kind of surprising that you find it so objectionable, since in your Are Libertarians Ideologues video, you explained that libertarians have higher IQs and, in my words, are sort of part of an intellectual elite. And not that I disagree with that, I certainly believe, as Plato's Socrates asserts in the Protagoras, that knowledge of how society should be run is a specialized skill, and that society should be run by an elite that possesses this specialized knowledge. But it seems strange to hold views like these and reject references to Aristotle because he carried a similar view to its conclusion in his society. And I want to mention again, I don't think it is absurd to suggest that we can have some idea about what Aristotle would think about industrialized society if we understand Aristotle's views as they have come down to us and also understand how industry changed society. So that was just dealing with Aristotle and slavery. I have to take issue with one other thing you said about my boy.
I have read Aristotle's Politics, and he's far from an authority on contemporary political philosophy.
See, it seems that you have this backwards. Our society, being so different than Aristotle's, doesn't give us a reason to dismiss him. Rather, the fact that his society was so different should be considered a reason that Aristotle's commentary on modern society might be incredibly valuable. People are biased by their personal experience. There is a Greek word, ekstasis, which means to look at yourself from an outside perspective. Basically, it's Plato's cave. Society is the cave, and in order to truly understand it or anything else about life, we must get outside of the cave. Our cave should be said to be modernity. And guess who's outside of our cave? Plato and Aristotle. Having them comment on our time is incredibly important because we can get a special view of what is permanent about human life. Our society has been altered by science, and so the pre-scientific view can potentially provide us with insights about certain aspects of life. Of course, I noticed that you approvingly featured Plato's ship of state metaphor in your video Anti-Democratic Thought, And I appreciate that since everyone knows of Plato's cave, but I wish more people knew of that metaphor. But you complained that Aristotle played a not-so-different role in my video. I guess it may just be that what I cited doesn't have a fancy name that it is known by.